record.
I've made you co-host, but I think I have set it up to record.
Yeah,
right,
it just said it is. Yeah.
Perfect. Excellent. Well, if that's okay, I will, and then I will end up muting myself, and we are now verifying my indexes 31% complete. I'm unclear what happened. Basically, I went to go add one last thing to my slideshow. It hung my computer. I couldn't even Control-Alt-Delete wouldn't, get me into any kind of task manager. So I was like, oh, I'll just restart my computer. And it was like, would you like to start in safe mode? And I was like, no, not really. I mean, like, let's go, babes. It's like 4:01. And the next thing I knew, it was like, oh, we need to do all kinds of things. So on that note, Decker, I hope that you can share. I don't imagine I made you co-host.
I think I can. Perfect.
Excellent. All right. Well, on that note, everybody, let us start. Yes, Decker has started screen sharing. I thank you. We are going to have a lovely day today, and more will be revealed. So we'll do art, and then break, and then SOSI.
There you go. So today we're going to be discussing one Art-Leutze. I've been trying to figure out how to pronounce his name, and I've gone to various sites, and I actually heard a news commentator, or no, maybe it was an art. Yeah, I think it was one of the art videos we're going to show, and it has the correct pronunciation of his name. I've never been able to get it right. Anyway, there are some inaccuracies in the art resource guide. I don't remember which emails to USAID this is going to entail from me, but I will be sending them later on. But in the meantime, we'll talk about how to answer questions based on the inaccuracies. Anyway, Art-Leutze was born near Württemberg, Germany in 1816. According to the Art Resource Guide, it gives a different town, but hey, what the heck. His parents were political refugees. They eventually fled Germany, moved to the United States in 1825. While there, Emmanuel studied art with one John Rubens Smith. He also worked as an itinerant portraitist, and we've talked a lot about that over the past few weeks. Artists that go door to door, instead of selling shoes, they're selling their art abilities. Anyway, he winds up in Washington, D.C., was there for several years, and then moves to Dusseldorf, Germany in 1840. And the reason why this is important is he studies formal art training at Dusseldorf's Royal Art Academy. Specifically, he studies history painting with one Wilhelm Schadow and Karl Lessing. Leutze becomes one of the leading artists of the Dusseldorf Academy. He returns to the United States around 1851. In the Art Resource Guide, it says 1851. Don't really quite have that pinned down. He might have come back a couple years after that, but US Resource Guide says 1851, so we'll go with it now. He would spend the rest of his life moving between Dusseldorf, New York, and Washington, meaning Washington, D.C., not Washington State. I should add that D.C. later. A lot of Germans coming into America around the same time, 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. There's revolutions going on over 1848 in Germany against the king. And Leutze is definitely sympathetic to revolting against aristocracy. I think he takes from his parents in that regard. And then it sort of takes this out of chronological context in the Art Resource Guide, but I like doing it in this order. They mention his most famous work, which he did near the end of his life in 1862. We're going to study something that he did in 1851, but they mention this. His westward course of empire takes its way. 1862, it's a mural, 20 by 30 feet mural on the west stairwell of the house wing in the Capitol. Yes, that's the same Capitol that was stormed on January 6th, and we're having hearings about and all that. So it's a wonder this wasn't disfigured. But it looks a lot like this. It looks kind of funky here. Well, it's because it's inset and these are on the sides. Okay. And if you want more, there's a really wonderful video on this, but really it's only mentioned once in the art resource guide. And this video is like 6 or 7 minutes long. Really, really fascinating. So if you want to watch a fascinating video about this work of his, Westward the Course of Empire Takes Its Way, it's an iconic work, but so is the one that we're studying. But imagine 20 feet high, 30 feet long, majestic, and the video explains a lot of the details in it. Absolutely fascinating. A little bit about the Dusseldorf Royal Art Academy that he went back and forth between, and initially went there in 1840. He actually goes there before a lot of other people start going there. And one thing it mentions in the Art Resource Guide is that the Dusseldorf Royal Art Academy at the time, well, actually not quite at the time, let's say it's still there in 1850. So I'll say yes. At the time, it says the Dusseldorf Royal Art Academy was led by one William Morris Hunt in the 1850s. And I notice I put question mark, exclamation mark. It says led by William Morris Hunt, but wherever I've gone, and I've done some research here, and here's just one resource that you can go to, talks about William Morris Hunt and his immense influence. And there's some interesting things about him. And again, it's a throw-off line in the Art Resource Guide, but I love going down these rabbit holes. And the reason why I'm mentioning it to you is, number one, this guy's a character. Number two, he did not lead the Dusseldorf Royal Art Academy the way it says in the Art Resource Guide. And this is one of my emails to USAD, because he simply did not. In fact, you know he did not when they he's sort of he's always leaving because he's not working well. Hunt went to Harvard College, but he was suspended from Harvard College several times for, quote, being too fond of amusement. Okay, this would be why I would be suspended several times, too fond of amusement. And it talks about how he works with Thomas Couture and people. Remember, we're not talking about Art-Leutze here, who is our artist in question. We're talking about Hunt, but it was just one of these rabbit holes I went down. And it talks about how he became very familiar and worked with Jean-Francois Millet. And the reason why I bring this up is I haven't yet lectured on section 1 of the Art Resource Guide. And one of the many interesting art periods and artists that we talk about is Millet. And Millet does a lot of really influential stuff that affects what they call the Barbizon School and the Hudson River Valley School, and later on Impressionism and things like that. So different things like that come up. And it's just what I want people to make connections when they read section 1 of the Art Resource Guide. There's fascinating pieces of information about the artists that they bring up. And they talk about him. I'm not going to go through this whole thing. They talk about him at the Dusseldorf Art Academy and different things like that. And there's no way he ever led it, because he was only in Dusseldorf for a short period of time where he leaves. He leaves. It's not his thing. Dusseldorf is simply not his thing. I can't remember where I found it here, but it's in there somewhere. So you'll just have to believe me and read it for yourselves. But there's no way in heck that the Dusseldorf Royal Art Academy was ever led by William Morris Hunt. Totally incompatible with how they did things. And I don't know why the art resource author says this line. Nowhere of the many sites I went to says this. Anyway, rabbit hole gone. Art-Leutze is there. I haven't figured out who is in charge of the Royal Art Academy when he was there, but it certainly was not William Morris Hunt. Among the American painters who passed through the Dusseldorf Royal Art Academy was Caleb Bingham, Eastman Johnson, Worthington Whitridge. What a great name, Worthington Whitridge. Richard Catton Woodville, and William S. Hazeltine. And it mentions in the Art Resource Guide that the Dusseldorf style is significant for its attention to drafting, dynamic compositions, and dramatic lighting. And all of this will come up in our painting that we're going to be discussing. Before people started swarming the Dusseldorf Royal Art Academy, people were American artists. Remember, there was nowhere to study art in the United States. First of all, we didn't have a United States in the early 1700s, late 1700s. We still didn't have art academies. We didn't have art academies until the mid 1800s, late 1800s. They certainly weren't well known. So if you were anybody, you went to Europe. And says Rome and Florence replaced London as a major draw for American artists in the early 1840s. But then by the time the 1850s rolls around, they start traveling to Germany. And one of the reasons for this is there's a lot of German immigrants coming over to what is now the United States. And so people get interested in, well, what's going on artistically over in Germany? So it's like London's a big place, and then Rome and Florence replace London, and then Germany becomes big. So just interesting how these change decade after decade. Leutze believed in America's democratic government. Again, his parents were very political. He was political, and he supported the
Deckert,
yes.
I'm going to try to join in using my computer so that I can have access to my whole computer and type and everything else. I'm warning everybody that if we all get disconnected, it's on me and my fault, and I'm hysterically laughing both at USAD and at these rabbit holes you're going down. But I just wanted to jump in and warn everybody. I'm going to mute myself and everything in case it starts echoing. But if it cuts everybody off, it's my fault.
Okay, we will blame you vociferously.
Perfect.
All right. Leutze, again, very political, very into these democratic ideals and against aristocracy. There was a German uprising in 1848 against the King of Germany, and he was very much supportive of that. Washington crossing the Delaware. This is painted to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Washington's death. Now, interesting, because Washington died in 1799. So 50th anniversary would be 1849, but it says that Leutze painted this in 1851. Well, we've probably started to prepare to paint it in 49. So it's like, okay, commemorating the 50th anniversary, what's 2 or 3 years among friends? We'll get back to this in a moment. Monumental and lionizing image, 12 feet wide by 21 feet long. Later on, like 12 years later, he's painting the previous work, the course of empire, westward course of empire thing that we talked about earlier, and that's 20 by 30, a much even larger piece, but 12 by 21 feet, extremely large. Fills an entire wall. Washington crossing the Delaware River, Christmas night, 1776. Read your social science guide. Cold winter, crossing was difficult. Boatmen struggling to navigate the icy waters. It's a critical victory for Washington. Remember, he prevailed against a battalion of Hessian soldiers who were stationed near Trenton, New Jersey. Today, you only have to defeat the Nets. Sorry. Okay. Came in a moment when Continental Army was struggling, and this helped restore the faith in the colonial cause. Not the painting, the actual event helped restore the faith in colonial cause. So it's painted to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Washington's death, because this was one of the turning points in the war. This was sort of a rallying cry, and there's a lot of historical inaccuracies in this painting, but it's done for dramatic effect. It's not painted, Leutze wasn't there. In fact, he wasn't even in the United States, even though the art resource guide said he was. He wasn't at the time, number one. He wasn't at the battle. Number two, he didn't paint this in the United States, even though the art resource guide says he did. So much to go on here. But first, since you may be tired of me, let's get a cool looking video of this, which is really great because I could do this, but not near as well as they do. So listen up, I'm going to play this video.
We're standing in a lovely skylit room in the Metropolitan Museum of Art looking at a very famous painting. But we're actually going to try a different method today. We're going to not talk about our assumptions about what we're seeing, but we're going to take the time to look closely.
We're standing with Sarah Alvarez, who's director of school programs at the Art Institute of Chicago. She's going to help us with this process.
I'd like for us to talk about some of the things that caught our attention when we first looked at this. It might be a feeling we had, it might be a particular detail in the painting.
Well, given that it's a cold January day, I immediately empathized with the very cold, windy weather.
What strikes me first is just the sheer size of this canvas. This was painted with a paintbrush. It must have taken forever.
We might want to take your observation and pose it as a question to ourselves. How was this made? What were the materials that were used? How long did it take? Those are questions that we can continue to explore, and we should make an inventory as we're talking about some of those things we're wondering about.
And asking those questions prompted me to ask another question, which is why it's so big. This could never fit in my house. Where was this intended to be?
We see a large number of figures packed into boats based on the way that they're all faced and other actions that we can see them making. They all seem to be moving in the same direction across a body of water. There's a tall figure in the boat that's in the foreground that is very determined looking. Is he the leader? Is he the most important? And how is he related to all of these other figures?
I also noticed that the figures seem wrapped up in their own worlds.
I'm noticing how distinct each one is from the other. They're wearing different clothing. They're not only in their own worlds, but they seem to come out of different worlds.
And I'm wondering, where is this frozen, cold place? There's these cloudy skies, and maybe that's a star, maybe that's the sun that is poking through the clouds.
I'm struck that the standing figure and the figure holding the flag seem immune to that cold. They seem so focused, so determined, so resolute, looking towards that far shore. The cold seems to pass over them.
There's also a sense of chaos around them.
It is really interesting how there is simultaneously both a frenetic energy and the sense of stillness and quiet. My eye keeps going back to that central figure. That's the only face that's not obscured, that's in profile. And it's illuminated by the sky behind it.
And around him are all of these diagonal lines, and all of those diagonal lines point to the right, and yet we know the boat is moving to the left.
And at the same time, those oars and that flagpole mark a kind of area that that central figure can inhabit and emphasize his importance even more.
One question is, are there other images in our mind, in our visual reference bank, that tell us that this is a person of importance?
He looks like a profile of a figure on a coin.
And the lighting reminds me of religious images. It reminds me of images where biblical events are unfolding.
We've talked a lot about the choices the artist has made to position the figures, the boat, the land, but there are some other even more fundamental characteristics of this painting, like the colors and the brushstrokes, that might be helpful for us to explore in order to generate some additional questions.
The things that are part of the natural world are cool, blues and whites and greens, and the boat, the things that are man-made, and the people and their clothing tend to be warmer colors.
It's almost as if there are layers of different kinds of tension that the artist has chosen to use in this painting.
This event is unfolding before us. Everyone except for that central figure is in the middle of moving.
If you look very closely, every single line and brushstroke is so precise and they feel so still, yet there's so much animation to a lot of the details. Again, another point of tension.
And it's like the artist wants us to notice those little details too. The bag, it looks like a bag that I've seen in galleries of Native American art, or the fur caps, these details of clothing that seem to differentiate the figures and draw us in to look at them.
It is remarkable how long this painting holds my attention. It does make me wonder whether or not it was designed to make a large, powerful impact initially, but then to draw me in to these little details.
Let's gather together the questions that we've posed. We've asked about the artist's intentions, the choices that the artist made, whether it be in the scale of the painting, the composition. We've asked a lot of questions about what's happening here. Who was meant to see this? Where was it meant to go? We have a lot of questions about the making of the painting and the initial reception of the painting. We might also ask questions about when it was made and how people have thought about it or experienced it since then. One of the important steps in our process is to think about what sources we use. We have documentation from the popular press that tells us about how people were engaging with the painting, what they saw, what they thought. We also have other kinds of materials like prints or keepsakes that were produced in vast quantities and distributed all over the country. All of these primary sources give us further information about this moment in time and the meaning of this painting. Let's just simply start with the title and date.
Washington crossing the Delaware. It's so tempting to say this was 1776, which is the date of the Declaration of Independence and the year that Washington crossed the Delaware. But this was actually made 75 years later.
And what do we know about the subject?
Well, we know that this was an important turning point in the Revolution, that Washington and his troops had lost several major battles to the British. The troops were disheartened, they were tired, there was a sense of hopelessness, and that this battle and the victory that followed changed the outlook of the revolutionaries and gave them hope for the future.
Washington's troops were crossing the Delaware in order to mount a sneak attack in the middle of the night against Hessian soldiers fighting on behalf of the British, that is, Germans. And Leutze had been born in Germany. He had grown up in the United States, but he had gone back, and he had painted this in the German city of Dusseldorf.
So what was happening in 1851 that might help us understand why Leutze decided to portray this subject at this time?
We know that there was a series of revolutions in Europe in 1848. There was a desire to overturn an old order of kings and emperors and create a new order where people had more say in their government.
And all of the different places where revolutions were happening essentially failed. There were many different groups of revolutionaries who could not unify to succeed in their efforts. And we know that Emanuel Leutze was sympathetic to this revolutionary cause, and a painting like this would provide hope.
We have George Washington leading the troops. But the time that the artist has spent on all the other individual figures and their clear differences makes me think about how revolutions are made up of people of different backgrounds coming together to fight for a single cause.
And it also suggests that a revolution is tenuous, that the success of the revolution is contingent upon the unity of diverse voices. This is the 50th anniversary of the death of George Washington in 1851. People are celebrating him as the great unifier of this young nation. There's also a moment in the United States at this time where even though unity exists, there's still a fractured nation. There's sectionalism, especially around the issue of slavery. And an image like this suggests that unity is possible.
And the reports are that the crowds were enormous, that people flocked to see this painting.
It offered them an image of unity in the face of incredible sectionalism in the United States in the 1850s.
And in December 12th of 1851, a notice in the New York Daily Times said that over 20,000 people have visited the exhibition. Quote, "The sight of such a splendid work of art will do more for the union of this country than 1,000 union speeches." And another notice in the Albion said that, quote, "We defy anyone possessed of one grain of sensibility to look upon it unmoved," referencing the emotional power of this painting.
For Americans in the mid-19th century, Washington himself, but also the Revolutionary War, it was this defining moment of American character that we together defeated the British.
Artists like Robert Colescott, Jacob Lawrence, and others have reproduced this image and told very different stories of American history.
And that's a reminder that a work of art is always a product of its own time and is itself a primary source.
And works of art do something really wonderful, which is that they play on our emotions, they pull at our senses, and they captivate us in a way that drives our sense of curiosity and gets us to ask questions that allow us to approach history in deeper and richer ways.
That is literally maybe one of the best art videos I have ever seen.
Wasn't that cool?
almost, I mean, just, I'm like in awe. Their approach before they talked about it, what they noticed in it, their way of connecting it to the history of the time it was painted, and then the history that continues on. I don't even have words. I don't know what that, I mean, it's obviously a Met production, but wow, like,
Cool stuff.
wow. Wow.
There's more. In the art resource guide, they specifically detail different things. They say the soldiers look cold and weary. Those holding oars strain and look awkward as they navigate the ice-strewn river. They're all individualized with different outfits. It doesn't, they alluded to it in the video. The art resource guide really doesn't get into it, but many of the different resources, the guy in the front, who by the way doesn't have an oar, he's got like an ice pick, giant ice pick. He's got a coonskin cap on. This guy is Scottish. He's got Scottish dress and hat on. This is an African American. It's specifically, here's a Native American Indian. They mentioned the people with the broad brimmed hats are farmers, and they know that because of their broad brims. Only 2 are in uniform. Here's another coonskin cap. It just trying to get forth the idea that they're all becoming united, and yet they're all coming from different backgrounds. And so there's a lot of inherent symbolism in this entire work. In contrast, we've got Washington solid, standing upright in the very small boat, clearly the focal point in profile. His cloak is blowing back behind him like the flag is blowing, creating a visual equivalency, they call it. And this is the part of the cloak that's really blowing more in the same direction as the flag. Rife with historical inaccuracies, the event took place at night, not sunrise. There wouldn't be any light. River not nearly as wide as it appears. This looks more like the Rhine River. And of course, being in Dusseldorf at the time, you know, he probably either didn't know what the Delaware looked like, or again, it doesn't matter. He's doing it for dramatic effect. It's this wide expanse, chunks of ice, okay, designed to instill patriotism, not connote geographic accuracy. Just all this interesting stuff here. It did mention in the video how often that this work of art later on gets referenced in other people's work of art, and they even mention that this then becomes a reference, not a reference, a source material, right? So one source material, they mentioned this in the video, and we also studied it in years past, 2 or 3 years ago. It's hard for me to remember at this point. Jacob Lawrence did his version of Washington crossing the Delaware in 1954. So here's 100 years later than Art-Leutze, that they pronounced it, and I can't remember already. This is egg tempera. Instead of 12 feet by 21 feet, this is 12 inches by 16 inches. Egg tempera on hardboard. This was a series of works. Each one was 12 inches by 16 inches. So foot and a quarter, right? This is number 10 of 30 from Lawrence's series, Struggle, from the History of the American People. And this one's titled We Crossed the River. And again, it's it's more of a modern, very geometric figures, a lot of triangles, a lot of diagonal lines, 3 rowboats containing members of Washington's army huddled under blankets. Diagonal lines of the boat oars digging downward into the water, counterbalanced by the lines of the soldiers' bayonets pointing towards the sky. Boat in center foreground has blood dripping off the side. Of course, red paint depicting blood. Blood suggests American freedom not achieved without violence. The focus of this work, the focus of Lawrence's work, is on the soldiers huddled in the blankets, rowing in unison, as opposed to the focus of the previous work being on Washington. This is on the collective people. In fact, everybody's sort of shrouded in these abstract, shapes. Emphasis on collective rather than individual effort. And if you click on the link, it'll take you to more of an explanation, but again, we're not going to get tested on this, but we were tested on this a few years ago.
I think we're all thinking it was last year. I think it was with water, not 2 years ago with Cold War.
Was it last year? It all blends together.
It all blends together.
We also talk about this work, which is George Washington Carver crossing the Delaware, page from an American history textbook. This was done by Robert Colescott in 1975, the year I graduated high school, long time ago. More biting satire than Lawrence. Replaces General George Washington with scientist inventor George Washington Carver, African-American scientist inventor. Both is filled with caricatured depictions of Black stereotypes, a comment on the inadequate way African-Americans have been represented in traditional histories of America, and especially in American high school history textbooks. Both Colescott and Lawrence used Art-Leutze's immediately recognizable image to focus attention on narratives that had been suppressed by the dominant culture. If you go to this link, it actually has different numbers. If you want to get into the characters, number 3, the heroic figures of Art-Leutze's painting are replaced by racist Black stereotypes to confront history, the role of the artist, and the role of the viewer. Colescott calls out the selective representations of Black people as told by a white establishment. Some historians understand the figures in this painting as white individuals in blackface. As early as the Second Enforcement Act of 1871, anti-discrimination legislation made racist imagery a punishable offense. However, blackface was still seen as humorous by white audiences. Colescott's sensational painting makes clear that the creation of racist stereotypes, such as the ones we see here, was a tool of the white majority to oppress people of color. Ever since I started doing those appropriations, there's been criticism. I started doing that in '75 when I painted George Washington Carver crossing the Delaware, which is a much more complicated painting than a lot of people think. It's a lot more than a one-liner. It's about white perceptions of Black people. It's the satire that kills the serpent. The art resource guide ends there, but I had to go one further. Well, oh, sorry, it doesn't end there. Sorry, 2 further. It mentions one more, referencing Leutze's painting. This is Shimomura crossing the Delaware. Roger Shimomura did this in 2010. Japanese-American artist reinterpreted scene through the lens of the Asian American experience. It's a large-scale self-portrait, 6 feet tall, 12 feet wide, 3 canvas panels. He replaces George Washington with himself. This is a caricaturized version of Roger Shimomura. Colonial soldiers replaced with samurai warriors, stylized water. And if you look at the waves, this one right here in particular, sort of taking a little hokusai with him.
Also from last year.
Also from last year. Stylized water, flattened composition, recall the Edo period prints of hokusai, his great wave, etc. This is San Francisco Harbor with Angel Island in the background. Thousands, that should read of, not if, thousands of Asian immigrants were processed on Angel Island in San Francisco. Transposed location instead of Delaware, right? River. Transposed location makes the point that Asian immigrant experience in America was as challenging as the difficulties faced by the colonists. Shimomura and his family were all detained at the internment camp for Japanese Americans in Idaho during World War II. Not an easy time, a lot of interesting references. And again, if you click on the links, you get a big blow up version. Notice very two-dimensional, symbolic of the Edo period, complete with the high horizon line, symbolic of Japanese prints of that time. Now I'm going to go one extra bit that the packet doesn't go because they didn't want to get political, but I couldn't resist. Here we have, again, the same imagery appropriated by both the left and the right in current political struggles. We have Trump crossing the Delaware, only in this case, we have Mad Magazine's version of Trump going over the falls, leading his men over the falls, complete with his wife's here in the background. It's got famous political figures. And of course, on the right, we have Trump lighting up the truth as they cross the swamp. So instead of draining the swamp, they're crossing the swamp. But again, all people know this imagery. The far left know it, the far right know it, Asians know it, African Americans know it, everybody knows it. This is a famous work. I'm certain, I don't remember the episode, but I'm certain there's a Simpsons episode where they're crossing the Delaware or something to that effect. It's just extremely iconic. And that's my bit. You're muted.
Absolutely fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. I'm just loving it. Well, we have a rabbit hole request, please, Mr. Decker.
I love rabbit holes.
I know. Well, our request is for a brief moment in the video, there looked to be a version of this painting, perhaps painted by someone identifying as female. Seemed to me a little bit almost in like a Frida Kahlo palette of
That's
colors.
certainly possible.
But it was towards the very end when they were going through like, look, this has been inspired by all these other things, and I loved that. And so my request is, could you please see if you could find that in the video, and maybe identify who that is by. Perhaps it even says it in the transcript or something.
In the video, okay.
In that video that I
didn't notice that.
I loved all of these. Well,
maybe I've seen these things too many times, and so then I missed these things.
One of the things I put into the chat very early on is that I took kids the year it was World War I, and it was the Armory show. I took a group of kids to New York, and we go all around the Met. And one of the things that we do is it's such a huge painting, you sort of have to stand there. But I definitely did not notice all of those things. So what I will say, hi Mom, you can unmute if you need to. I will pause the video and we'll give an early break today, which is actually perfect because I have a lot of things to talk about and to set up, I think, for Wednesday. We'll see how far I get, but I think if I get there, we'll set up for Wednesday. So let me pause the video. It's 4:43. Let's round that off, 4:44 now. So it's 4:45. Let's break until 4:55. Break until 4:55. I don't think I'm going anywhere, but I will pause the recording. Recording. Hi, welcome back. We went down such a fun rabbit hole while everybody was gone. we will include all these other amazing works that were based on Washington crossing the Delaware.
They won't test you on those,
That
but
they won't test us on, but it's just such a cool.
they will test you on the Jacob Lawrence and the Colescott.
Right.
And the Shimamura. Those three are the ones that they mentioned.
So yes, which I really loved. I mean, I really, really loved.
Oh, and I didn't mention Lutz. Leutze, I can't pronounce this thing. He died at 52, and he died of heat exhaustion in Washington, D.C. in 1868. He was only 52 years old. And I'm thinking, okay, it's 114 out.
I was just gonna say, like, this is like what happens.
AC. In fact, my computer just says record high. Yeah.
I was literally just thinking, like, when the Olympics were in Rio and they were like, all the commentators during the marathon were like, I cannot believe it is so hot here. It's 85. And like, Bakersfield fell over laughing. Like, are we serious?
Well, it's humidity that gets you,
Yeah, whatever. But I grew up in New York
It's a
City.
dry heat.
It's a dry heat. It is a dry heat. Oh my God, it is crazy. All right. So on that note, so to speak, let us move over to the academic SOSI packet. Now, so I just wanted to point out, we stopped here last time and I said, remind me that my mother pointed out that the original Declaration of Independence was handwritten on a huge sheet of paper. And as my mother said, I mean, imagine writing it, there's no erasing. It's a quill pen on a large piece of paper. Some of you have great handwriting that can, keep a straight line, but that is not my skill set. And I have many skill sets in life, and being able to write neatly is definitely not one of them. Fascinating idea. Dunlop actually wrote it on a printing press and lined up with the letters. Thank you to the printing press, but right. Imagine writing neatly. I feel like we should all take our hats off to Philip Lynn right now.
Okay, wait. Before you get this started in earnest, I have to make okay. I was digging through my file cabinet here in the back room and finding like papers that I wrote in 8th grade, and just horrible handwriting. Well, my dad finally got me a typewriter. Now, we're not even talking electric typewriter, we're talking manual typewriter. Typed up this report for science, and in the upper left-hand corner, I've been telling my students this for years, but I could never find it for show and tell. Finally found it. It's for my 8th grade science teacher, and up in the corner it says, I do not accept typewritten reports.
Wow.
I expected everything to be handwritten. And this is how the world has changed
since
the 60s.
I get it.
Just saying.
I get it. I get it. I get it. So this is where we last left off. And as I said, I think when we finished, that I was including this video, which is where the people were reading the Declaration of Independence out loud, so that if you went back and found the 5 parts and everything else of the Declaration, you could maybe understand it a little bit more. And so that is where we left off. Nope, we're not going to listen to you. Stop it. Okay, so today we're going to talk about what happened. Literally, fun fact, remember we said section 2 is all the battles and section 3 is supposed to be the political and social history and background of the United States. Okay, so it's going to skip from the Declaration of Independence to post-war. Like they don't go through any of the stuff in the war. It's wild. It's wild. Okay, so it starts out, this section starts out with the Lee Resolution. Remember the Lee Resolution? I did not remember the Lee Resolution. So I went back and I copy pasted from an earlier slide, the Lee Resolution, which basically said that he was the delegate from Virginia, and he is the one who proposed that they write a declaration of independence, that these united colonies ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that the connection should be severed and dissolved between Great Britain. Basically, before they actually get together and write the Declaration of Independence, Richard Henry Lee gets up and says, hey, we should write a Declaration of Independence, and it should say, screw you, Britain, we're outie, peace out. And so in the rest of it, which is not written about in the packet, but it included not only like, hey, Britain, peace, but it also said, and before we leave here, we have got to have a system in place to govern ourselves. There's that meme I put on where the dog is walking his own leash. And, Lee was like, look, fam, we can't just leave. We got to get something in place. So he called it a plan of confederation. And it reminds me of the book that's called A Confederacy of Dunces. But it basically, a confederation is like a grouping. And so it was like a plan of agreeing to work with each other, a joint agreement with each other between the colonies. But remember that the Lee resolution is kind of like, ooh, we don't want a central government because we have one in the form of Great Britain and it's not working for us. But they do need something that is going to help them fight coordinatedly, if that's a word, together against the British. So they create a loose union where each state retains its own sovereignty, its own system of rule, its own freedoms, its own independence, but they're going to work together for the greater good. But each of the states is completely and totally independent. And they call this document, this guiding document, the Articles of Confederation. Articles because it sort of listed what had to be done, and Confederation because they were all going to work together. And it was more like a treaty for self-defense and defending each other, one of those like, if they attack you, I'll come to your rescue kind of treaties that we're always getting into. It really didn't have a good blueprint for a common government. So like it didn't say, and there shall be a president. It didn't say, and we should have representatives. It was basically like, hey, we can raise an army, sort of, kind of, and not pay them and everything else. Okay. So June 12th, 1776, before the Declaration of Independence was signed, because the Lee resolution says, hey, if we're going to declare independence, we've got to, get our act together. They form a committee. A guy named John Dickinson becomes the chairman. You remember him maybe because he is the one who does not want to declare independence. He is the author of the Olive Branch petition that's like, okay, look, we don't really want to be an independent thing, and he sends the people off to go tell the king, and the king doesn't even read it. So for a month they work on this, and then they debate it, and fabulous like understatement, they're like, it takes longer than it should have because the Congress keeps needing to run away from the British because the British keep advancing. So they have to keep like, packing all their stuff up and like moving farther north. So whatever. That's my smiley face. Yeah, basically like, so the question marks that came up are like state sovereignty, and sovereignty means the right to govern yourself. So they really wanted to leave in place, not we should unite and be a country against Britain that's also a country, but like we are a loose collection of states and you just need to, like, if you don't like it here, go elsewhere kind of thing, kind of the same thing that states are now. It granted specific powers to make laws and to execute them to the Congress, but that was the only governing body, was this group of people, this Congress. It also talked about how, those were like issues, like retaining sovereignty, what powers were going to be granted to Congress. They ended up granting them like the right to fight, but and negotiate a treaty, kind of, but like not a lot of other stuff. There was the question of how to handle Western land claims. And I want you to remove in your brain the concept of Western as we live it now. Western back in this day doesn't even mean to the Mississippi. Like they haven't even explored to the Mississippi. So Western means like sort of just west of Pennsylvania, what we would call the Midwest now, but that's part of it. How to vote, that's going to be a big one. How to vote for people. Some people wanted the people to vote, by which I mean white men, landowners. Other people wanted like just the elected officials to vote for each other, kind of like, you know, this little narrow thing. And whether to have a judiciary, which it's a fancy name for like the Supreme Court. You know, whether to have some kind of like a group of people or a person who would sort of judge the fairness of laws. And so they create this document in June of 1776, and they basically pass it November 15th, 1777. So we are not following Lee's resolution. We have already declared war. Britain has already preempted us by declaring that we're in a state of rebellion. And so it takes a year and a half to even say, yes, we'll accept the Articles of Confederation, but that's what we do. And basically the rights that they granted to the Congress were they could declare war. They could make a treaty with a foreign nation, which basically was like, we're already doing that, right? We're already fighting the Revolutionary War, and we'd like to make a treaty with France, and Spain and the Netherlands to get money. And we hope to win this war and make a treaty with the British. So fun fact, we should be able to do that. We should be able to, the legislative bodies should be able to adjudicate disputes between states. That's a fancy word for being like a, you know, somebody who kind of says, okay, stop fighting. Here's how I'm gonna solve this issue between these two states that might not be getting along so well, especially with trade or slaves or anything like that. The Congress should be able to borrow and print money. And they should be able to, like, you know, the Bernie meme, I am once again asking for your support. They should be able to ask states for money. There was no chief executive. There's no president. There's no judiciary. There's no Supreme Court. And the national government, fun fact, it could write the treaty. It could sign the treaty, but it couldn't enforce the treaty if anybody wasn't paying attention to it. So like that whole idea of like the Western land claims, if people were like, you know, you told me that I should be able to take this land, you know, but I'm not going to, or I am going to, and you said I couldn't, but I'm going to do it anyway. They don't have an army, like a national army, to like go in and solve that dispute at all. They also couldn't tax states or individuals, so they could ask for money, but it had to be voluntarily given. They couldn't say, in fact, this is why we have an amendment that it says that there is a tax, like that you have to pay taxes. And it basically kept this idea of state sovereignty by giving each state one vote, regardless of size, population, wealth, economy, whatever, one vote, one state. So 13 votes, 13 states, the end, goodbye. That was it. And that gets passed in 1777. And it had to be, yes, exactly, Nikki, like, please, money. It had to be approved unanimously. That was the rule that they had set up, that they weren't going to, now, granted, we're in the middle of the war, so that was it. It had to be approved unanimously in order to be adopted, and also for later changes, which they will quickly amend later. 12 states approved it by February. Remember, everything takes a little bit longer back there. Maryland didn't want to approve it because it wanted larger states to turn over any extra land to the federal government, which it eventually will under the Constitution. But so they start talking about it in June. They decide to submit it back to the states in 1777. The states have to then take it back to their actual legislatures that are local. So like, you know, New York has to take it back to New York, and Connecticut has to take it back to Connecticut, Massachusetts has to take it back to Massachusetts, and whatever. Takes November, December, January, February. So 3 months, everybody approves it, except for Maryland that doesn't approve it until February 2nd, 1781, meaning that the war is already over. Like, thanks though, Maryland. Basically, it just kind of went into effect, even though Maryland didn't say yes. That's kind of how they did this. Okay, so now it's 1781. So we've talked about all of the battles that took place. And now we've had in section 2, it's like, and it ends with the Treaty of Paris, one of the 80 bajillion things called the Treaty of Paris that ends the Revolutionary War, the end. And now section 3 is caught up to that, because here we are in the 1780s. All right, so finally, once Maryland approves it, the Articles of Confederation are enacted. The Confederation Congress becomes the governing body. It basically is like, you know, great, that's terrific, but war's over. Lovely. And we still don't have really a working government in place. So, you know, Lee must be crying at this point. Okay. So one of the things that happens in 1783, when they finally get the Treaty of Paris signed and then war is over, is that Britain gives the territory that is west of the Appalachian Mountains, north of the Ohio River, and east of the Mississippi to the US. So that is this sort of yellowish area here. It is north of the Ohio River. And if you know your boundaries at all, this thing over here in the right-hand corner, that's going to be Ohio. It's not yet. It's just, this is the Ohio River. East of the Mississippi. So this dark black line is the Mississippi River. You can see it comes to a delta over here in Louisiana. This is this boot-shaped, will be a boot-shaped state later. West of the Appalachians, which are along this, like they're not on this map, but they're kind of like straight over here. So the Northwest Territory gets turned over to who? Well, it gets turned over to the Congressional Congress and this sort of governing body, this sort of federal group. And a year later, the Ordinance of 1784 says, okay, that land is like one big chunk. How do we admit it? Like, we want more states. How do we do that? So they create a couple more ordinances. These are all, you can lump them all together in your head. They're all called ordinances. The Land Ordinance of 1785 says, okay, if anybody wants that land, here's how to do it. And they confusingly call it selling the land. Really, it's people. Like, let's say I want to move my family out to where the capital N is in Northwest Territory. I've decided I want to be a homesteader. I want to farm out there, or I don't know, raise cows or whatever I want to do. So there is a procedure that gets enacted that they don't go into it all, and you don't have to worry about it. But basically, they're going to be land surveyors, and they're going to say, okay, this acreage of land out here is going to be worth X number of dollars per acre. And if somebody wants it, they're going to essentially pay the federal government and say, I now own this land. So the federal government owns it and is going to sell it to the people, and the people are going to buy it. So this kind of codified who was going to do the surveying, how they were going to determine the worth, and then who to contact when you wanted to buy your stuff. And then finally, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 basically took those extra lands from that were being held by Pennsylvania. Virginia had some, New York had some, Connecticut, some, Massachusetts had some. In their original charters, when they made themselves states in the very beginning, they said, these are my boundaries, but they were kind of nebulous on the western side. It basically took those chunks of land also and gave them to the federal government as well. And it finally, that last one, the 1787 Northwest Ordinance, says, all right, you can, right now, it's just like giant open land. And when an area has 60,000 inhabitants, those 60,000 people can sort of set a boundary that says within this boundary is 60,000 people. and we would like to apply for statehood. And if they did that and checked their boxes and dotted their I's and crossed their T's, they could be admitted as states, and they would be on equal footing with the original 13 colonies. So in that respect, it was a pretty cool set of laws. Like, hey, we know that there's more land even farther and farther west. Here's how to become a state. Here's how to become a state. So Ohio is going to be the first state that is admitted by this system. You don't need to know the dates of this, but I thought that this visual was kind of cool because basically it lists it in the order that they are admitted to the union. And it turns out to be the same order that is listed in the packet, but they don't say that and the years don't matter. So Ohio basically, it just kind of moves this way. It kind of moves farther and farther west as it makes sense, as people like fill up those areas and keep going. So Ohio's 1803, and then Indiana and Illinois kind of going across this way, and then back up to Michigan, which is the one that looks like a mitten, and Wisconsin, and then a piece of what will eventually become Minnesota, but not yet. It basically stopped at the Mississippi River, but eventually Minnesota is going to go beyond the Mississippi River. So the other thing that was important about this Northwest Ordinance of 1787, this final one, is that it prohibited more slavery in this territory. Thomas Jefferson was back when the war ended, was like, we should prevent slaves, like these new states from having slaves, which is funny because he owned slaves. And it basically made the Ohio River, which you can see here in this graphic is this bottom thing, the bottom of Ohio. That's the dividing line. North of this, no slaves. South of this, slaves. But because the southern states didn't love this idea, spoiler alert, they're never going to love this idea. This is going to happen again. If enslaved persons ran away and crossed the Ohio River, they were going to be returned to their home states. It's going to be an issue. Hold that thought. Okay, but as we've talked about before, there's an economic crisis that's happening. During the war, the British Navy, first of all, had blockaded the ports and did not let trade come and go here. And the Treaty of Paris actually forbid the new United States from doing business with like the British and the Caribbean sugar plantations that they had. And it had restricted exports to Britain. They were negotiating with France, with the Dutch, in the Netherlands, with Spain, with everything else. And we owed a lot of countries a lot of money, right? We had borrowed from Spain and France and the Netherlands. And that created really high inflation. You want to know what inflation is like? This is what's happening right now. Right now, the United States is also going through a period of inflation. So it's fascinating that we're talking about this. Many states adopted what is termed a Republican response, but the word Republican does not mean the Republican political party as we now understand it. The word Republican really comes from like ancient Rome, where a Republican government is where it's basically a government that is by the people and for the people. It is not a political party. In fact, political parties are not going to be discussed yet. Instead, essentially a lot of states, remember they all had sovereignty, they were like, ooh, everybody's really in trouble. Merchants can't trade really well with people. People have no money. We're trying to give money to the war effort. Even if we weren't giving money to the feds, we were trying to supply our own militiamen with arms and bullets and guns and clothing and food and everything else. A lot of people are in a lot of debt right now. So we're going to pass a lot of debtor laws. What are debtor laws? They're laws favorable to the people who owe money. Do you know when we passed other great debtor laws? Was during COVID. So when we said during COVID, like you don't have to pay the landlord, like renters forgiveness, you don't have to pay your student loan debt. student loan debt forgiveness. They put a pause on all of that during the COVID era. Well, the same thing happened back in the 1780s. Most states basically said, okay, we know if you owe money, your repayment is going to be extended. We used to throw people in jail for debt, and they said, we're not going to do that right now. And the states themselves, because we don't have a federal mint that produces federally recognized money for all of the states of the union, they started printing paper money instead of like using gold or silver or something that is valuable kind of across the whole board. So like you might have a Maryland dollar that might or might not be accepted in Massachusetts. So that's going to, yes, all of this is so true. So the people who were in debt were like, this is great. And the people who needed to get paid, just like now, like the landlords were like, I can't live like this, whatever. All of this, by the way, there's a link here on this website, by the way, that like where USAID took literally like all of the wording here and just copy and pasted it. Like it is amazingly plagiarized. One of the things that happened is basically this quote from James Madison, which is actually quoted in the packet, that essentially says, we're setting up a really bad precedent where what's going to make people hate each other is money and class. And he called it property. But essentially, it is this idea that the haves versus the have-nots is going to be a problem. It is. He's right. He was right. Okay. So the one exception to this is Massachusetts. All these other 12 states are like, yay, we should be kind to the debtors. And Massachusetts, which remember was like the siege of Boston, like, John Hancock, all these people who are like, trade is king, were not into the whole, like, we should forgive debt. Like that is not a thing that they were doing. Plus, Massachusetts especially was feeling the economic crisis. Why? Because they were trying to trade with European powers, and European powers were, by the way, not accepting paper money that was printed in Georgia. They wanted actual hard currency. So the merchants in Boston and in Massachusetts were not able to just accept like trade, oh, you'll give me 3 goats, for food. Okay, I'll take your goats. They wanted actual hard currency because they couldn't ship goats over to, some other country and pay them off. Because they were getting squeezed by their European suppliers, they began to demand the same from their American business partners and customers. Okay, so note to self, Maureen will take the goats if you would like them, whatever. So in Massachusetts, a lot of rural farmers had their lands or their possessions seized and or were thrown into prison. And that really like increased the resentment against the courts and the tax collectors. So they started to complain. And there's this guy called Old Plow Jogger who makes a complaint. And his complaint was actually recorded, not like somebody wrote it down. He said, I have been greatly abused. I have been obliged to do more than my part in the war. I have been loaded with class rates, town rates, province rates, these are all taxes, continental rates, and all rates of taxation. Been pulled and hauled by sheriffs, constables, and collectors, and had my cattle sold for less than they were worth. The great men are going to get all that we have, and I think it's time for us to rise and put a stop to it and have no more courts, nor sheriffs, nor collectors, nor lawyers. And all the little people in Massachusetts were like, damn straight, old plow jogger man, he knows what's going on. We should rebel. I mean, remember, they just rebelled, right? Why not rebellion 2.0 here? And so there started in Massachusetts the first major armed rebellion that was after the American Revolution. So they didn't, just like the American Declaration of Independence, it didn't start with a get out of my life. First, they went to their state legislatures. They said to the Massachusetts state legislature, hey, can you issue us some paper money that we can pay our debts with. And the legislature was mostly merchants, mostly the upper class who did not want, made up paper money, and said no. And then they made an extra property tax. So they like doubled down on their idea. John Adams actually wrote to Thomas Jefferson and was like, damn, dude, like this not going to be a good thing. This tax will be heavier than the people can bear. So Massachusetts is sort of shaped like a rectangle. Boston, of course, is right at the eastern coast, on your way, I think it's this way, at eastern seaboard. Western Massachusetts was like, all right, bring it, beesies. They're all veterans of the Continental Army. They all just fought in, slightly disorganized militias. Here we go, here we go. So they held covert meetings, they planned an organized response. They started preventing the county courts from opening, first in Northampton and then in Worcester. And the Massachusetts legislature was like, hey, go get them. And the official militiamen, like the constables, the police and whatever, they were like, no, I'm not arresting my neighbor for protesting your stupid taxes. I'm on his side. I'm not going to do that. All right. So Daniel Shays and Luke Day get together and kind of stoke the fire. So they're both Continental Army officers. They gather everybody together. They shut down courts throughout New England, and then they illegally liberated prisoners from around Massachusetts. The feds couldn't come in to put down the rebellion because the feds have no power and no army and no money and they're like, would you like to enforce a treaty with France? We can do that. So the feds are completely unable to help anybody with anything. The governor of Massachusetts, who fascinatingly is called Governor Bowdoin, which is an excellent school that one of my best friends teaches at in Maine now, named after him. He was like, hey, you know how to solve this? Let's pay off a privately funded militia. Let's just sink that in for a second. The government of Massachusetts cannot call for federal help. The state guards will not go to war against their fellow compatriots. So the Boston rich merchants that want to get paid gather their money and hire mercenaries. They recruited 3,000 of them, led by Benjamin Lincoln, who was one of the guys we mentioned in section 2 as one of the Continental Army guys, but now he's like, I can make some bank like this, whatever. The Shaysite Army, I love that name. The Shaysite Army tried to seize the federal arsenal at Springfield. So the feds have all their cannons and weaponry and everything in a fort, and Shays goes in and tries to capture it and fails there. And the leaders, Shays and Day and a lot of the other people, flee to Vermont and New Hampshire, and Vermont and New Hampshire won't extradite them and whatever. They won't do that. Okay, so the revolution, that little mini revolution, is over. It is put down by the paid mercenary troops hired by Boston merchants. 4,000 people sign confessions that say that they have participated in Shays' rebellion. Several hundred are indicted, but most of them are pardoned. Shays and a few others were convicted and sentenced to death, but most of the courts then overturned those convictions, or they were pardoned, or they just were done. Shays basically moves to upstate New York and just dies of old age later. But it's just one example. There were a lot of local level, very popular, very rural social movements that saw rebellion as the way to go and how to, because they had just had the revolution. Conflicts went from all the way up by Maine to all the way down south towards Florida. A lot of people saw these rebellions as really dangerous to this new American nation that was trying to allow the people to govern themselves. They were like, hey, this is not working well because the unwashed masses would like to govern themselves, and we don't want that to be. And it really brought to in sharp focus the fact that the federal government had no power to manage its own interior conflicts. So everybody got back together to address the Articles of Confederation because they were like, yo, this is not working for us. So the Articles of Confederation are weak, and we're going to create a constitution that is going to be stronger. So here we go. Some people are wanting a stronger national government because of the Shays Revolution. Also, meanwhile, back at the ranch, the British and Native Americans in that Western area, like they're not going quietly into that good night. They're, you know, fight against the dying of the light. You know, they're like, hey, we should continue to have skirmishes over here. And the Confederation Congress couldn't prevent states from disregarding or violating the Treaty of Paris, which, you know, gave this land to the feds and all this other stuff. So there are 13 colonies. 6 of them get together in Annapolis, Maryland in September of 1786. So 10 years after the start of the revolution, 6 of them get together to talk about interstate commerce, trading state to state. And James Madison from Virginia is like, dude, like, can the articles even work or whatever? So they're all these 6 states are like, okay, look, Philadelphia, 1787, be there or be square. We're going to revise the Articles of the Confederation. So 55 delegates from 12 states, with Rhode Island not participating, come together. Now that's interesting, 55 delegates from 12 states. And the reason it's interesting is because if you remember, the Articles of Confederation say very clearly that one state, one vote, but they don't just send 12 guys to go debate this. They send a lot of delegates to really discuss it. The attendees included Ben Franklin and George Washington and James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, all these famous people that you've heard about. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were serving as diplomats in France, so we're not part of it. We're there. You'll notice, though, that all of these people are like rich white landowners or people who are you know, merchants. Nobody who was an artisan, meaning like a skilled craftsperson, like a silversmith, like, you know, that Paul Revere kind of level, you know, whatever. Nobody who was a craftsman or a farmer came, and they make the point of talking about yeoman farmers and tenant farmers. Yeoman own their own land. So yeoman own their own land. Tenants, farmers, rent, like tenant agreements are renters. So those people are not included. We're going to make a government, but we're not going to include the real people here, the little people. We're just going to have the rich people here. Okay, so all white men, part of the elite socioeconomic class. A lot of them favored a very strong central government and pro-creditor, anti-debtor laws. So they're not like, hey, let's forgive everybody, let's make paper money, let's just, you know, let's not worry about it. They're more like the Massachusetts group that were like, screw them, throw them in jail, man. They were worried that the Articles of Confederation gave too much power to the states, so they wanted to make the federal government more powerful, because they were worried that, like Shays' revolution, it was going to be, you know, an inability to put down a lot of revolution. So they make it almost immediately, they're going to scrap the whole Articles of Confederation and have a strong federal government to deal with diplomacy, trade, money, currency, right? Not statewide paper money, but like, or even regional paper money, but like a national money, and to repay the public debt. So they decided that they needed to keep that one vote per state, you know, a requirement of the Articles of Confederation. And they decided not to allow the journalists or the press or to keep records of what was said, so that they could, quote unquote, explore issues in a spirit of honest scrutiny, according to the packet, which, okay, maybe, you know, but they are definitely able to say this stuff. Okay, so there are going to be two different plans, right? Remember, they're getting rid of the Articles of Constitution and they're going to write the Constitution. So James Madison, before anybody even gets there, is like, you know what? I have some great ideas. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to have three branches of government, legislative, executive, and judiciary, which should sound a little bit familiar. Because that's literally what we ended up doing. So he was like, okay, here's the legislature. The legislature should have two houses, a lower house and an upper house. This is kind of what England does also. The lower house should be directly voted in by the people. So we're going to have like a big lower house that is going to be directly voted in by the people. And then the people that are voted in are going to get together and from their own selves choose the upper house that is going to actually like make the laws. So like the common people will vote for the lower house, and then the lower house will vote for an upper house that's like smaller and more lawmaking. And they're also gonna pick the president for the executive branch, and they're also gonna pick the Supreme Court justices for the judiciary branch. So he was like, this is this great plan. It's called the Virginia Plan because that's where James Madison lives. It was also called the Large State Plan. The controversy came because the lower house was going to be voted in based on population. And so the question became, well, bigger states then what are more powerful? And what's population? That's going to be a big question as well. Is it literally number of people, which is going to have a wrench thrown into that system because of the enslaved population? Or could we just say that it's how much money you have? And the more money you have, the more votes you can buy. So James Madison like bypasses the entire American system where we pretend that it is not money driven. And instead is like, okay, we should just say if you're richer, you get more votes. This obviously favored the larger states like Pennsylvania and Virginia that have a lot of people and that have, sorry, I'm getting hot, have a lot of people and a lot of wealth, right? So this is James Madison's Virginia Plan or the Large State Plan. Not surprisingly, the small states were like, what is that? So the small states countered with what they like to call the New Jersey Plan or the Small State Plan. And they basically held on to the same concept as the Articles of the Constitution or the Articles of Confederation that said one state, one vote. The Electoral College is an interesting, let us have an entire discussion on the Electoral College because kind of, yes, it is population based sort of, but it's also this really weird system. And yeah, it's that idea of the big state for large state plan where like you elect people, but then they can do their own thing. Like they're not bound by what the people who put them in there says. Okay, so two plans, not as conflicting as one might imagine, but should we have a bicameral legislature or a unicameral one, like a one house one? So the members of the Constitutional Convention, which is what they're calling themselves, they're together in a convention trying to write a better constitution. They appointed a committee to try to come up with a solution. They have these two plans on the table. What are we going to pick? What are we going to let go of? What's going on here? They met from July 2nd to the 16th. In 1787, and they come up with the Connecticut Compromise, CC, the Connecticut Compromise, which is also what Constitution starts with, so that's easy to remember, otherwise known as the Great Compromise, So they created this bicameral house, where legislative body, there's instead of a lower and an upper, they have a House of Representatives and a Senate. So the House of Representatives is right now 427 people. It is literally like some randomly weird number because you get one representative per number of people in your state. So if you count by, I don't even remember what the number is, but like states with very small populations might have 2 or 3 or 4 representatives in the House of Representatives. States like California with a huge population have like 40 something representatives in the House of Representatives. In the House, you are directly elected by the people. That still stays true. But then they created a Senate, and rather than the House electing senators, was in this proposal, we actually directly elect our senators. In California, we have like Dianne Feinstein is a senator, like, so the American people, the Californians voted for her. But the Connecticut Compromise instead had this idea of the lower house electing the upper house, the House of Representatives electing the Senate. So that part is a little weird for us, but in the Senate, every state had 2 representatives. That's why even today there are 100 members of the Senate, and the Vice President of the United States is the 101st person and only votes if there's a 50-50 tie. So the House has some weird random number of people depending on the population, and it kind of keeps growing, and gets redistributed and whatever. And the Senate is always 100 people, always 100 people, 2 from every state. So it was both large state and small state inclusive. Okay, so what's a population? Okay, the Constitution did not mention the word slave. The framers of the Constitution, all these people who were meeting, thought that it would, and I use the word, sully the document if it had direct references to slavery. Like, it would make the document not as pretty and nice. I just want to point out that if you're thinking you own a person, I don't think the word slavery in a document is one of your problems that you should have, but whatever. Yeah, exactly. So they didn't directly address the slavery question, but they protected the institution of slavery, even though some of them were against this concept. And it starts with, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Right? I mean, like, this is the founding documents of our nation, and whatever. But the reason they did that was because otherwise the Southern states wouldn't vote for it. And remember, the Articles of Confederation say that if you don't have unanimous votes, you can't put it into effect. So what gets put into the Constitution as a compromise? Well, number one is the 3/5 compromise. Many of you have already heard this. Southern states wanted their enslaved populations to count in terms of their number of representatives, but not, of course, be able to vote as people, because if they voted, they'd be like, we would like to vote for not being slaves anymore. The northern states were like, you know what, only free people should vote, which will keep you very, very small and politically worthless. And the compromise was that you could count enslaved persons as 3/5 of a person. Like, that's how they would find, the House of Representatives was based on each enslaved person being worth 3/5 of a white person. I feel nauseous saying that. I just want to point that out. Okay. There also was a rule put in there about the slave trade. George Mason, surprisingly of Virginia, home of slaves, suggested outlawing the trading of slaves. He said, we should not allow people to buy and sell human beings. Georgia and South Carolina did one of these and opposed that concept. So the compromise was that they kicked it down the road. They said, okay, we will ban the slave trade in 1808, which is 20 years from now. This will go into effect 20 years from now. We'll stop importing slaves. Great. And finally, there was the fugitive slave clause. Fugitive, of course, means runaway. So Southern states demanded that enslaved persons needed to be returned. This was the law in the Northwest territories, in the Northwest Ordinance. The northern states, of course, opposed that clause, and we're going to hold out on it, but the Southern states agreed to some shipping and trading compromises, like that benefited places like Massachusetts. And so Massachusetts agreed to vote that slaves would have to be returned. It also gave the feds power to suppress domestic rebellions. Like Massachusetts was really worried about another Shays Rebellion uprising. And it could be useful if slaves rebelled, right? They would have to be returned back. They couldn't come north and fight north. Remember, this is before the Civil War. This is long before the Civil War. So this is going to be a thing that is a thing. Okay. James Madison felt that representation by states was good, that this issue of slavery was going to, he was like, you know, foreseeing the future. He was like, wow, this is really going to be problematic down the road. And he was right. It's 1861. The quote said, "It seemed now to be pretty well understood that the real difference of interests lay not between large and small, but between northern and southern states. The institution of slavery and its consequences forms the line of discrimination." So he knew that this was going to be problematic. What time is it here? It is 5:44. All right, good. So we can get up to where I lecture today. So now they've written this Constitution. It has to get ratified. It has to get approved. To this day, when we have amendments to the Constitution, they also have to get ratified. There's a whole procedure for it. So the Articles of Confederacy, which weirdly is called AOC, which I only associate with the feisty House of Representatives rep from New York, but apparently also stands for Articles of Confederacy, requires that everybody approve of it. And this wasn't just a change to the Articles of Confederation. This was like, we're going to throw it all out and start again. So every single state legislature had to vote to approve it. And that was a questionable ask, right? Because some states were like, I don't want to give up my state sovereignty. Screw it, forget it. I'm going to vote no. Remember, Rhode Island doesn't even send a delegation to this 55 member rewriting thing. So like, you know, not everybody's on board here. So the framers were like, who needs, you know, this universal approval? They're like, you know what, this is so new. We're going to go with 2/3 approval. So there are 13 original colonies. If 9 of them vote for it, that'll be 69%. That is an easy number to remember. It is also going to be more than 2/3, right? 2/3 would be 66%. So if 9 states out of the 13 vote for it, is good enough for us, babies. And so the Confederation Congress was like, sounds like a plan. And then they didn't say like, okay, please vote for it. They just sort of were like, great, go back to your state legislatures, see what you want to do. Peace out again. Okay, so this breaks the US into essentially, or the argument into 2 sides, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. So the Federalists, also called nationalists, want a strong federal government. The Anti-Federalists are against a strong national government. So the Federalists were like, you know what, this is the only way to keep the new United States going. We won our independence, but the only way to get to keep our freedom going is if we have a strong centralized government. And they used as some of their arguments the economic crisis that was happening throughout that entire decade, like the Shays Rebellion, the people rebelling, and the federal government has no way to, you know, put that down. There aren't universal laws, anything like that. And the Federalists were like, look, we're more worried about rebellions from the little people than we are about a tyrant taking over and like being like a new crazy king. We're more worried about like this Republican government, like meaning the government by the people and for the people, than we are about like some, you know, big thing. James Madison, in fact, said that the Constitution, should everybody vote for it, provides a Republican remedy, remember again, Republican meaning people's remedy, for the diseases most incident to the Republican government. In other words, when you have a messy system where the people elect the government and it's, there's no king or anything like that. There are issues that are inherent in that, and that the Constitution is the best way to solve those issues. It is created for the people, and it will help solve the issues that the people bring up. The Federalists were well funded. They were well organized. And many of the newspapers, which were kind of, Northern based, were supportive of the Federalist point of view. So they had the press kind of on their side. They were able to publish pamphlets and talk about people, why you should vote for, why you should tell your own state legislatures to vote for it. And finally, there were some pretty important people who were Federalists, who were publicly Federalists, including Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay, these guys over here in the picture, and George Washington, hugely successful off of his career as a general in the Revolution, and Ben Franklin. So the Federalists are like, hey, we've got power. Yes, we do. We've got power. How about you? And the anti-Federalists were like, nope. They were also called localists because they believed in local state sovereignty and not federal sovereignty. All right. It's a diverse coalition of people, kind of like Shays Rebellion, kind of like all those people that were not at the Constitutional Convention, all the little people. George Mason, that guy from Virginia, was like, look, this plan is totally subversive to every principle that has governed us up until now. This federal power is calculated to annihilate totally all of the state governments and state rights. What are you doing? They were not quite as well organized as the Federalists. They did have some famous members, again, people who had been important in the Revolution, like Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee. He's the Lee Resolution, the guy who said we should declare independence, but first have an Articles of Confederation in place. George Mason, John Hancock, Mr. Big Signature, and Samuel Adams. Also farmers, particularly yeomen who owned their own land, and all the people in the Western frontier, none of whom had a vote. Basically, their major issue was, look, we just won the right to govern ourselves. And this Constitution does not explicitly guarantee that we get to keep those rights. We're really scared that we're going to lose these rights because you have a bicameral legislation and an executive president and a judiciary, and then nowhere does it say that I have, like, let's say, freedom of speech. There's no individual protections for me. Spoiler alert, there will be before we pass this Constitution. Most state governments had put those kinds of protections into their own state legislature write-ups. The federal government did not put those in. And the states were like, look, when the British controlled us, we didn't have those rights, like no taxation without representation. We need those in there. We're nervous about them. We're really worried about them. The anti-federalists published a lot of essays. They did so not under their own names, but under pseudonyms. There was one called Cato, one called Federal Farmer, one called Columbian Patriot, and somebody Robert Yates, who went by the name of Brutus. Brutus wrote one of these essays, these anti-federalist essays. He wrote, ought not a government vested with such extensive and indefinite authority to have been restricted by a declaration of rights? It certainly ought. You're giving this federal government so much power. Don't you think that, like, it should have some rights, that we should declare that people have rights? Yes, we should. So clear a point is this that I cannot help suspecting that persons who attempt to persuade people that such reservations were less necessary under this Constitution than under those of the states are willfully endeavoring to deceive and to lead you into an absolute state of vassalage. If we don't get protections in there, people are telling you to just vote for this, you're going to lose all your individual rights. And they're deceiving you. They're lying to you. They're like, oh, it doesn't matter. We'll be fine. no, 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 do not vote for this, this new constitution. The Federalists were publishing their own papers, 85 essays over the course of 10 months. They were written also under a pseudonym instead of Brutus. They were written under the pseudonym Publius, and Publius is Latin for the public. So they are trying to speak for the public. Hamilton writes 51 of them. James Madison writes 29 of them. John Jay writes the whole 5 of them. In those essays, they explained why we need a strong centralized government. Maureen, I've got to see this play because I know none of this. They say, look, we're safe from a tyrannical government. We're safe from it because we're going to have 3 branches and that will create checks and balances. And one of the most persuasive of these arguments is, they're all numbered 1 through 85. And so one of the most persuasive arguments is the Federalist 10, essay number 10, which says essentially that, look, agriculture has its interests at heart. Hamilton really is true. It's so true. Manufacturing has their interests. The merchants have their interests. And it's not that anybody's going to be unselfish. It's that the selfish interests of all the different people will essentially keep everybody else in check. So like there won't be too many concessions to the farmers because the manufacturing sections are going to fight that. And there won't be so many concessions to manufacturing, like the manufacturers, like the factories won't get extra bonuses because the merchants will keep them in check. So don't worry about it. We're all just going to keep everybody in check. And in a perfect set of timing, we're going to take Wednesday to do some literature, because it turns out that 2 of our short selections for the literature are Federalist 1 and Federalist 10. So literally, we are going to be reading from pages 83 to 91, which includes Federalist 1 by Hamilton and Federalist 10 by Madison. I have asked the lady at school, the copy lady at school, to print lit packets. I don't know, she didn't get back to me today, so I don't know if she did that or not. I asked for 40 copies. They're sitting and waiting or they will be sitting and waiting for us. If not, instead of lecturing on Wednesday about more SOSI, we're gonna just sort of stop and duck left and go into actually reading the primary sources, Federalist 1 and Federalist 10. It's about 10 pages worth. If you want to pre-read them, we will be going over them. I find the language hard. You know, as I always remember Nikki typing, those are 2 sentences. So that's what we're going to be doing on Wednesday is Fed 1 and Fed 10. I don't know if they actually call them that, but that is where we are for here. And then when we are, you know, once we do that on Wednesday for next week, we'll talk, obviously the Constitution does get ratified. We put in the Bill of Rights, which is going to be the compromise of how we get out of not having any codified things there. And we will try next week to basically finish the rest of section 3. Today is the anniversary, unfortunately, of when Maureen, you should definitely text that to me because I don't know it at all. Today's the anniversary that Aaron Burr shot Alexander Hamilton. He died tomorrow, but they got it. They got into it in the 1800s. Like this is 20 years later. They got into it, but that was definitely it. So on that note, it is 5:59. I'm going to stop the recording. I'm going to say goodbye to everybody. And if anybody has questions, of course, stick around. I will put onto the Discord, Jack, I think you have access to the packets, but we'll be looking at the lit packet next on Wednesday. But for everybody else, I will throw out on Discord. I'll stop by. Oh, thank you, sweetheart. I will click on that link. And I will go, it's gonna start playing, isn't it? I just literally, no, stop it, stop it, stop it. Go, hang on, hang on, hang on. Okay, it's called nonstop. Okay, there you go. You can tell I clicked on it. Long story short, if the packets get printed, I will let you know. Or if anybody's at summer school, I know June's at summer school. I don't know who else is actually on campus for summer school, but I don't think they'll be out where you guys can get to them. So I'll stop by and see if they make them. I like to have the physical packet, with me, but we all have access to it on electronically as well. So that's what's going to go on. Have a wonderful day. I'm stopping the recording.